You open your eyes and find yourself standing in the gilded corridors of the Palace of Versailles. The air smells faintly of wax candles and polished wood, though it is heavy too with the perfume of 1,000 courtiers. Versailles, for all its golden glamour, is not simply a palace, it is a machine of ritual. Every gesture, every nod, every rule is designed not for comfort, but for control. The Sun King, Louis XIV, sits at the center of this machine. He rose to the throne in 1643, though as a child king, he spent many years under the guidance of Cardinal Mazarin. By the time Mazarin died in 1661, Louis resolved that he would never again allow ministers to dominate him. He embodied his own words, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state." Versailles became his tool of governance, not through military strength alone, but through etiquette, spectacle, and endless ritual. It is easy to imagine the king rising in the morning. But for Louis, waking was not a private affair. It was a ceremony, the lever du roi, the rising of the king. Dozens of courtiers waited in antechambers, hoping to be admitted into the king's room as he awoke. The honor of handing him his stockings, or helping him slip his arm into a coat, could determine one's fortune at court. These were not trivial moments, they were steps in a ladder of influence, carefully regulated and distributed by the king. Imagine the quiet shuffle of shoes on the parquet floors, the hushed whispers of noblemen waiting their turn. A duke might edge closer to the chamber door, while a minor noble, assigned a lesser privilege, lingered behind. To hold the candle during the king's prayers was a gift of access. To pass the shirt was more than dressing, it was proximity to the center of power. And this was not the only ritual. Meals too were a public spectacle. The grand couvert, the king's supper, was eaten not in solitude but in front of an audience. Nobles stood and watched as Louis dined, their eyes fixed upon him while he lifted his spoon, broke bread, or reached for wine. To be granted a stool to sit during these meals was a coveted privilege. To serve the king at table was a signal of favor. But for most, watching was enough, because in watching, they reinforced the theater of authority. The corridors of Versailles echoed with the rules of precedence. Who walked ahead of whom, who was permitted a chair, who could cover their head in the king's presence, all these things mattered. A slight misstep could cost years of careful maneuvering. Nobles were known to study the order of entrances, the protocols of address, and even the exact manner of bowing. For Louis XIV, these elaborate rituals were not simply vanity. They were a form of governance. By keeping the nobility busy with questions of dress, ceremony, and attendance, he prevented them from building power elsewhere. A noble consumed with the question of whether his sleeve was cut in the proper fashion was less likely to plot rebellion in his province. A duke desperate for the honor of handing the king his gloves would think less of mobilizing his army against the crown. Yet life at Versailles was not all splendor. Beneath the shimmering chandeliers lay the daily discomforts of the palace. The halls were crowded, noisy, and often drafty. The smell of unwashed bodies lingered despite the heavy perfumes. Despite its fountains and gardens, plumbing was primitive, and nobles often relieved themselves in corners or behind staircases. Servants scurried endlessly, carrying food, water, and chamber pots through corridors already packed with silk and lace. The rules extended even into matters of fashion. At Versailles, the king set the style. He was especially fond of high-heeled shoes, and soon the entire court tottered on elevated heels, regardless of comfort. Wigs, powdered and elaborate, grew taller each season. Nobles spent fortunes on clothing, for to appear unfashionable was to risk exclusion. Tailors, wig-makers, and perfumers thrived. But many noble families sank into debt simply to maintain appearances. And then there was the matter of attendance. Life at Versailles required near constant presence. Nobles were expected to spend months at the palace, attending not only ceremonies but also balls, hunts, and performances. Even leisure was a duty. Absence was noticed, and absence suggested disloyalty. The king's eye was everywhere, and he made sure his courtiers knew it. One might wonder how a society could function when so much attention was paid to trifles. But it was precisely in these trifles that Louis XIV's genius lay. By controlling etiquette, he controlled access. By controlling access, he controlled ambition. Versailles was not simply a palace, it was a web, with the king at the center, and the nobles caught in its silken threads. And so the daily life of Versailles was a strange balance, glittering yet uncomfortable, powerful yet hollow, splendid yet suffocating. Every candle lit, every curtain drawn, every bow made to the floor was part of a larger system designed to remind all who entered that power radiated from one man alone. As you walk through the mirrored halls, watching nobles fidget with lace cuffs or argue quietly about the order of procession, you may begin to wonder, how long could such a system of endless ritual truly last before its own weight pulled it down? The morning has passed, and Versailles hums with its daily rhythm. The courtiers, each dressed in their finest silks and powdered wigs, move through the long corridors, pausing to bow, to whisper, or to linger in hopes of catching the king's eye. To live at Versailles is to live inside a performance, and every noble is both actor and audience, bound by rules that cannot be broken without consequence. You notice how carefully everything is ordered. Nothing at Versailles is left to chance. From the moment the king rises in the lever du roi to the final candle extinguished in the evening, every gesture is part of a larger choreography. But this order was not simply about beauty. It was about power, Louis XIV's power, which depended on his ability to place every noble in a fixed position within his orbit. The most visible sign of this ordering was the rigid system of privileges. These privileges governed not only titles and land but also the smallest matters of etiquette. To sit in the presence of the king was a privilege. To ride in a carriage with more than 2 horses was a privilege. Even to wear certain fabrics was reserved for those of sufficient rank. The rules seem tedious to us now, but for the courtiers, they were the lines that defined their existence. Imagine, for a moment, being a minor noble of modest means, recently arrived at Versailles. You are dazzled by the chandeliers, the gardens, and the endless procession of richly dressed lords and ladies. But you also quickly realize that survival here does not depend on your sword, or even on your wit, but on your mastery of rules. You must learn when to bow, how low to bend, when to remove your hat, when to remain silent, and when to flatter. A wrong step could earn you ridicule, and ridicule could end your chances of advancement. The king himself was the supreme arbiter. Louis XIV rarely lost his composure in public, but he was known to notice every detail. He remembered who attended, who was absent, who dressed appropriately, and who whispered at the wrong time. Nobles feared being dismissed from the king's presence, for exclusion was as damaging as open punishment. To be invisible at Versailles was to be politically dead. One of the more curious aspects of court life was the way space itself was used to reinforce hierarchy. The closer your lodging was to the king's apartments, the higher your status. Nobles competed desperately for rooms near the royal chambers, even if those rooms were cramped, dark, and uncomfortable. To live in a damp little cell just steps away from the king's bedchamber was worth more than a vast estate in the countryside. Proximity was influence. Distance was irrelevance. And yet, for all its grandeur, life at Versailles was deeply inconvenient. The palace was never designed with comfort in mind. The kitchens were far from the dining halls, meaning food often arrived cold. Heating was uneven, with great halls drafty in winter and suffocating in summer. The perfumes that nobles wore were not merely for fashion, but for necessity. Sewers and waste disposal lagged far behind the palace's magnificence. Servants carried chamber pots through gilded corridors, and courtiers sometimes relieved themselves in stairwells, creating a stench that even the gardens could not mask. But these discomforts were accepted as the price of participation. To be at Versailles was to endure. Nobles mortgaged lands, sold heirlooms, and plunged into debt to keep up appearances. Tailors, jewelers, and wigmakers grew wealthy, supplying endless demands for new fashions. A dress worn twice in the same season could mark a lady as careless. A gentleman's wig that sagged or lacked sufficient powder could become a subject of gossip. Behind all this ceremony lay the king's clever strategy. He had transformed the nobility into courtiers, dependent not on their own estates or armies, but on the king's favor. They spent fortunes chasing honors, instead of building power bases that might challenge him. Even military leaders, proud of their victories, found themselves competing for the honor of handing the king a napkin. At times, the rules bordered on the absurd. During meals, nobles stood for hours simply to watch the king eat. To be offered a stool, a small mercy for weary legs, was a mark of favor. During hunts, courtiers scrambled for the honor of riding near the king, though it meant jostling in dangerous proximity to horses and hounds. Even illness could not excuse one from participation. There are accounts of nobles collapsing from exhaustion, rising again, and forcing themselves back into the endless cycle of attendance. And yet, amidst this carefully controlled environment, small rebellions simmered. Courtiers whispered in corners, exchanging gossip that could ruin reputations. Pamphlets circulated secretly, mocking the king's extravagance. Letters carried news back to the provinces, where resentment grew over the vast sums poured into the palace while peasants struggled with hunger. The nobility might have been distracted, but they were not entirely blind. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a stage where the king played his role as the sun, and every noble orbited around him. The courtiers smiled, bowed, and performed, but behind their powdered faces and polite words lay frustration, envy, and exhaustion. The rituals that bound them also wearied them. And so, as the golden light of evening filtered through the hall of mirrors, reflecting endlessly in glass and gold, one could not help but wonder, could a system built on ceremony, privilege, and spectacle survive in a world that was slowly beginning to ask questions about equality, reason, and freedom? The palace is quieter now. Candles flicker against the mirrors, casting endless reflections of gold and shadow. The courtiers drift toward their chambers, their stiff silks rustling in the dim corridors. Yet even in these quieter hours, Versailles does not sleep. Somewhere, servants carry trays of food and wine to private gatherings. Somewhere, an ambitious noble rehearses lines of flattery for tomorrow's audience with the king. The theater of Versailles never truly ends. Louis XIV himself remained at the center of this theater until his final years. For more than 70 years he ruled, weaving his life into ritual, and ritual into governance. But time is patient, and time does what no noble, no general, and no minister could do. It erodes even the most carefully constructed order. By the early 18th century, the cost of maintaining Versailles had become staggering. The fountains alone consumed vast quantities of water, requiring entire engineering systems to divert rivers and construct pumping stations. Thousands of servants, cooks, cleaners, and gardeners worked tirelessly to keep the palace functioning. The expenses of balls, operas, hunts, and endless feasts drained the treasury. Meanwhile, the people of France bore the weight of taxation, and their resentment grew. Yet inside the palace, the rituals continued unchanged. Nobles still crowded for the privilege of handing the king his shirt. They still studied the order of procession, still measured one another's wigs and jewels. But outside the gilded gates, a different France was emerging. Philosophers questioned the divine right of kings. Pamphlets and essays asked whether privilege was truly just. The Age of Enlightenment whispered ideas that no bow, no ceremony, no golden mirror could silence. The very strength of Versailles, its ability to trap nobles in a web of etiquette, also became its weakness. Nobles who might once have been leaders in their provinces had been turned into courtiers, dependent on favor. They lacked the independence to act, even when crisis struck. France's institutions weakened as a result, leaving the state vulnerable to financial collapse and political upheaval. When Louis XIV died in 1715, after a reign of 72 years, the palace fell into a strange silence. The courtiers gathered, but the Sun King's absence left them without the gravitational pull that had ordered their lives. His successor, Louis XV, inherited the palace and the rituals, but not the same commanding authority. Etiquette continued, but it began to feel more like burden than brilliance. By the later 18th century, Versailles had become a symbol as much as a palace. To the nobility, it remained the stage of ambition. To the people of France, it became the image of excess. When Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette ruled, the old ceremonies persisted, but they carried a different weight. Watching the king dine, or fighting for the honor of holding his candle, no longer inspired awe, it inspired ridicule. The rituals once meant to strengthen authority now highlighted its absurdity. The palace, once designed to hold the nobility captive through spectacle, could not hold back the tide of revolution. By 1789, when angry crowds marched on Versailles, the golden halls no longer glittered with unquestioned power. They seemed instead like relics of a fading age. The people demanded bread, liberty, and equality, not ceremony and privilege. When the royal family was forced to leave Versailles for Paris, the palace was left behind like a magnificent stage with no actors. The rituals, the lever du roi, the grand couvert, the endless bows and curtsies, vanished almost overnight. What had seemed so permanent, so vital, so unshakable, dissolved in the face of new realities. And yet, Versailles remains. Its gardens still stretch in endless lines, its mirrors still reflect light, its halls still echo with the footsteps of tourists who wander through today. The palace is silent, but the memory of its rituals lingers. The etiquette of Versailles reminds us of how power can be maintained not only by armies or wealth, but by the smallest details of daily life: who sits, who stands, who bows, who dares to speak. As you stand in the Hall of Mirrors one last time, the reflection stretching out into infinity, you cannot help but wonder, if such an elaborate system of rules could collapse so swiftly, how many of the structures that surround us today, so solid, so permanent in appearance, are in truth just rituals waiting to be broken. You find yourself standing before an immense set of red walls, their tiled roofs gleaming with golden ridges. The gates rise taller than any building you have seen before, carved with dragons and guarded by watchful eyes. This is Beijing, and you are about to step inside the Forbidden City, the heart of the Ming and Qing dynasties, and for centuries the most regulated royal court in the world. From the outside, the Forbidden City appears like a fortress. Thick walls, nearly 30 feet high, stretch for miles, enclosing nearly 180 acres. A wide moat encircles the entire compound, reflecting the symmetry of the architecture. Yet the true power of the city lies not in its defenses, but in its rules. For here, within the walls, every detail of life was governed by codes of ritual so precise that even silence itself became a form of communication. The Forbidden City was built in the early 15th century under Emperor Yongle of the Ming dynasty. Its construction required the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers, artisans carving beams, laborers hauling stone, and painters decorating vast halls in the imperial red and gold that symbolized power. But what was built was more than a palace, it was a world unto itself. The emperor was the Son of Heaven, the mediator between heaven and earth. And so, the palace had to reflect not merely royal authority, but cosmic order. Walking through its gates, you would notice the city's strict symmetry. Buildings aligned along a central axis. Courtyards followed one another in endless succession, narrowing as you approached the emperor's private quarters. This design was not accidental, it was symbolic. Each step forward brought you closer to the ultimate source of power. But at the same time, each step demanded ritual, for no one simply walked into the presence of the emperor. Court life inside the Forbidden City revolved around ceremonies. The emperor's day began before dawn with officials gathering in the great courtyards to await the morning audience. Dressed in formal robes of silk, with embroidered ranks of cranes, lions, or other symbols stitched upon their chests, they stood in lines according to rank. To stand even slightly out of place was a breach of decorum. To speak at the wrong time, or to look directly at the emperor without permission, could mean dismissal, exile, or worse. When the emperor appeared, silence fell across the courtyard. Officials would kneel and bow, touching their foreheads to the ground in the ritual of kowtow. 9 bows were customary, symbolizing the 9 heavens. The sound of forehead striking stone echoed across the courtyard, a sound as regular as the ticking of a clock. Each movement was scripted, each pause deliberate. But etiquette at the Forbidden City was not limited to grand ceremonies. It reached into the smallest details of daily life. There were rules about where officials could walk, what doors they could use, and even where they could stand when waiting. Servants, eunuchs, guards, and officials all had designated paths and spaces, so that the movement of thousands within the palace flowed like a carefully choreographed dance. Even objects carried meaning. The color yellow, for instance, was reserved for the emperor alone. No subject could wear it without permission, and to do so was considered an act of rebellion. Dragons with 5 claws were the sole symbol of the emperor, while lesser dragons with 4 claws might decorate the robes of princes or high officials. To confuse these symbols was not a trivial mistake, it was an insult to the cosmic hierarchy. Food too was governed by rules. The emperor's meals were prepared in vast kitchens, with dozens of dishes served at once. Each dish was inspected for poison, and tasters sampled the food before it reached the table. Even the way dishes were presented followed ritual, placement, number, and variety all carried symbolic significance. The emperor himself rarely ate much, but the abundance was a sign of heaven's favor. And then there was the silence. Unlike Versailles, where courtiers filled halls with chatter and gossip, the Forbidden City demanded restraint. Officials spoke only when spoken to. Servants moved quietly, their presence marked more by the shuffle of soft shoes than by words. Even the eunuchs, who held immense influence behind the scenes, spoke in hushed tones. Silence was not emptiness, it was a form of order. Yet beneath the surface of ritual, the palace was a place of tension. Eunuchs competed for influence, scholars debated policies in whispers, and rival factions watched one another with suspicion. The emperor was the axis upon which the system turned, but even he was bound by rules. He could not simply ignore rituals, for to do so would upset the harmony of heaven and earth. For those who lived within these walls, life was defined not by freedom, but by precision. Each bow, each step, each word carried meaning. A life of ritual might seem suffocating, but it was also a form of survival. To follow the rules was to remain invisible, and invisibility was often the safest position in a world where a single misstep could mean disgrace. As you stand in one of the vast courtyards, the red walls stretching around you, the golden roofs glinting in the morning light, you can almost hear the echo of foreheads striking stone, the murmur of silk robes shifting in the cold air. The city seems eternal, unchanging, governed by rules that promise order for centuries. But deep within, you may begin to wonder, could a palace so dependent on silence and ritual withstand the changing voices of history beyond its walls? The morning ceremonies are finished, but the forbidden city does not rest. Behind the red lacquered doors and gilded beams, life continues in a web of regulation, authority, and hidden rivalries. Every person within these walls, whether emperor, eunuch, concubine, or scholar official, plays a role in sustaining the order of the court. And yet, beneath the glittering roofs and silent courtyards, power is constantly shifting. To understand this world, you must begin with the eunuchs. They were not simply servants. They were the eyes, ears, and hands of the emperor. Castrated in youth, eunuchs were cut off from family lines and inheritance, making them entirely dependent on imperial favor. This dependence made them both loyal and dangerous. Over time, eunuchs became gatekeepers of access, deciding who could approach the throne and whose petitions reached the emperor's desk. The emperor might rule as the son of heaven, but in practice, he saw the world through the eyes of his eunuchs. Their control of information meant that they could elevate allies or ruin enemies. Some became infamous for corruption, accepting bribes to carry messages or manipulate decisions. Others wielded quiet but immense influence, shaping the direction of dynasties from behind the curtains of the palace. Yet eunuchs were not the only players. Scholar officials, trained through the imperial examination system, represented a very different kind of power. Selected through grueling tests on Confucian classics, they were considered the moral backbone of governance. Where eunuchs embodied personal loyalty to the emperor, scholar officials embodied loyalty to tradition, ritual, and the bureaucratic state. This created constant tension within the court, a balance between those who upheld the rules of Confucian order and those who operated through personal influence. Daily life in the Forbidden City reflected this tension. Scholar officials gathered each morning to present memorials, written reports on taxes, harvests, military matters, or local disputes. These documents were carried to the emperor, often passing through eunuchs first. To present a memorial was both an act of duty and risk, for a poorly phrased sentence could be seen as criticism of the throne. Many officials spent sleepless nights drafting their reports, weighing every character, balancing honesty with caution. Meanwhile, the emperor's harem, the concubines and empress, formed another sphere of influence. Though officially confined to the inner court, their rivalries could spill into matters of succession and politics. The birth of an imperial son carried immense importance, and with it came favoritism, jealousy, and intrigue. Eunuchs often served as intermediaries between the women's quarters and the emperor, which further increased their power. Every aspect of court life was governed by regulations so detailed that volumes of manuals were written to explain them. The Huangqiao Liqui Tushi, the illustrated regulations on the ceremonial paraphernalia of the dynasty, for instance, recorded everything from the correct design of imperial robes to the precise dimensions of ceremonial vessels. These rules extended into the smallest gestures, the angle of a bow, the number of steps between one official and another, even the way incense smoke should rise during rituals. To break with these patterns was not simply a personal error, it was a disruption of cosmic order. But within these strict rules, survival required subtlety. Officials formed alliances, not openly, but through coded language in petitions, through small favors, or through marriages arranged outside the palace walls. Eunuchs, though officially forbidden from owning property or adopting heirs, often smuggled wealth to relatives or built secret networks. Even the emperor himself, bound by expectation, sometimes found ways to bend ritual, delaying ceremonies, favoring certain officials, or choosing to remain in seclusion. Despite the silence of the palace, rumor was constant. Courtiers whispered about which eunuch had gained influence, which concubine had caught the emperor's eye, which official had fallen from favor. The palace was a world where everything mattered, the placement of a seat, the order of a procession, the gift of a jade ornament. To be overlooked could mean irrelevance. To be noticed at the wrong moment could mean disaster. The weight of this constant surveillance and regulation created both order and fear. For many within the palace, survival meant embracing invisibility, performing duties exactly as prescribed, avoiding notice, speaking only when required. But invisibility had its own dangers, for it meant losing the chance to rise. The court demanded a delicate balance, be visible enough to gain favor, but not so visible as to invite envy or suspicion. And still, the rituals continued, day after day. The bowing, the kowtowing, the endless memorials, the carefully measured meals. On the surface, the forbidden city seemed eternal, unchanging, immune to time. But just beyond its walls, China faced famines, rebellions, and foreign pressures. While the palace perfected its codes of silence, the world outside was shifting in ways the emperor and his courtiers could not entirely control. Standing in one of the shaded corridors, you might pause to wonder, if the court was so consumed with ceremony and rivalry, who was truly steering the empire through the storms beyond its walls? Night has fallen over the forbidden city. Lanterns glow softly against the red walls, and the tiled roofs glisten faintly in the moonlight. From afar, the palace appears eternal, untouched by time, a place where rituals hold the world together. Yet within these walls, cracks have begun to spread, small at first, then wider, until silence itself can no longer conceal them. For centuries, the system of rules and ceremonies kept the emperor at the center of the empire. The daily audiences, the kowtows, the memorials, the endless regulations of dress and movement, all these reinforced the idea that the emperor was the son of heaven, the pivot between earth and sky. But this elaborate order also came with a cost, rigidity. Where flexibility was needed, ritual demanded repetition. Where new ideas were required, tradition silenced. Change. The eunuchs, once servants, had become powerful gatekeepers. Some amassed fortunes, controlled secret police, and manipulated successions. Scholar officials, trained in Confucian classics, resisted their influence, but their own devotion to precedent left them ill-prepared for the crises of a changing world. While these two factions battled silently within the palace, the problems beyond its walls grew louder. Natural disasters, famines, and rebellion strained the empire. Peasants demanded relief, soldiers demanded pay, merchants demanded fairer treatment. Foreign powers, first Portuguese traders, then Jesuit missionaries, and eventually European empires with cannons and gunboats, pressed against China's borders. Yet within the Forbidden City, daily life continued much the same: bows, rituals, meals, silences. The palace moved in circles while the world moved forward. By the late Ming dynasty, corruption and mismanagement had hollowed out imperial authority. Eunuchs like Wei Zhongxian became infamous for their ruthless control, while scholar officials struggled to restrain them. When the dynasty finally collapsed in 1644, the Forbidden City was invaded by rebel forces before being handed to the rising Qing dynasty. For a moment, silence was broken by the clash of swords and the chaos of fire. But soon, the rituals returned, re-established under the new rulers, as if the walls themselves demanded their continuation. The Qing emperors, especially Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, revived the system with vigor. They presided over grand ceremonies, received tributary missions from distant lands, and filled the palace with art, poetry, and ritual. For a time, it seemed the system had regained strength. The Forbidden City glowed with renewed authority, its courtyards filled with bows and silences once again. But beneath this resurgence, the same weaknesses remained. Rituals could enforce obedience, but they could not solve the empire's deeper problems. The court remained consumed by hierarchy and precedence, while the empire faced rebellions such as the White Lotus Uprising, foreign encroachment, and internal economic strain. Scholar officials debated minor points of ceremony while European powers charted new sea routes and devised new weapons. By the 19th century, the cracks could no longer be hidden. The Opium Wars forced China into humiliating treaties. Foreign embassies demanded access, even within the sacred space of the Forbidden City itself. The rituals that once kept the emperor untouchable now seemed outdated in a world of iron steamships and Western diplomacy. The silence of the palace, once a sign of cosmic order, became a sign of irrelevance. When the last dynasty, the Qing, faced the revolution of 1911, the Forbidden City stood as a symbol of the past. The young Emperor Puyi, just a child, remained within its walls even after abdicating the throne. He wandered through vast, empty halls, surrounded by rituals that no longer carried meaning. The kowtows, the silks, the ceremonial vessels, all became relics in a world that had moved on. And yet, the Forbidden City endures. Its walls still rise above Beijing, its courtyards still stretch in perfect symmetry, its silence still lingers in the air. Tourists now walk where eunuchs once hurried and where officials once bowed. The rituals are gone, but the memory remains, preserved in the architecture itself. The story of the Forbidden City's silent codes reminds us that power is not only about armies or laws, it is about the rules people agree to follow, the gestures that give meaning to authority, the silences that sustain order. But it also reminds us that when those rules no longer serve the needs of a people, even the most magnificent palace can become a prison of its own rituals. As you leave the great red gates behind, you may pause and wonder, how many of the rules we follow today, silent, unquestioned, seemingly eternal, are in truth fragile rituals, waiting for history to sweep them aside. The year is 1650, and you find yourself walking along the wide, gravel-paved avenue leading to Edo Castle. The great wooden gates rise before you, their beams blackened with age, guarded by watchtowers and moats. Beyond them lies not only the residence of the Tokugawa shogun, but the heart of a system that has transformed Japan into a land of order, silence, and endless rules. Unlike the courts of Versailles or Beijing, the shogun's power was not cloaked in divine imagery or cosmic symbolism. Instead, it rested on military dominance, forged during centuries of war, and then frozen into strict hierarchy during the long Tokugawa peace. From 1603 until 1868, the Tokugawa shoguns ruled Japan through a balance of ceremony, surveillance, and carefully controlled appearances. Edo, which grew into one of the world's largest cities, was their stage. At the center of this stage stood the shogun himself, rarely seen, seldom heard, yet always present in the structure of society. His castle was vast, its compound stretching across miles, with inner and outer layers of defense. The shogun's immediate residence, the Hanmaru, was surrounded by moats, walls, and guarded gates. Even approaching his quarters required passing through layers of permission, checkpoints, and bows. Life in Edo Castle revolved around a ritual known as ogasho, or formal audience. Daimyo, regional lords who controlled the provinces, were required to appear before the shogun at regular intervals. They wore elaborate robes of silk, carried swords at their sides, and followed strict rules of movement. To bow at the correct angle, to kneel at the right distance, to speak only when granted permission, all were essential. A misplaced gesture could mark disrespect, and disrespect could lead to exile or loss of land. This ritual was part of a larger system called Sankenkotai, or alternate attendance. Under this system, daimyo were required to spend alternating years in Edo and in their home provinces. Their families, however, remained in Edo year-round, effectively as hostages. This ensured loyalty. No lord could rebel without endangering his wife and children. The requirement also drained daimyo coffers, for the cost of maintaining two households, along with the expensive journeys of hundreds of retainers traveling each year, was staggering. Picture the long processions of daimyo as they traveled to Edo, hundreds of samurai marching in rows, banners fluttering, horses decorated with lacquered saddles and jingling bells. The spectacle was part of the ritual, for each lord displayed his wealth and loyalty in equal measure. Ordinary townspeople lined the roads to watch, their curiosity mingled with awe. Yet beneath the grandeur was a subtle truth: the shogunate had transformed military power into pageantry. What once was war became procession. What once was rebellion became ritual. Inside Edo Castle, space itself reflected hierarchy. The further one moved into the inner compound, the greater the restrictions. The great halls were lined with tatami mats, and each mat marked not just a place to sit, but a measure of rank. A daimyo's position within the audience chamber revealed his standing in the shogunate's order. No word was spoken without ritual, no gift offered without protocol. Even the shogun himself appeared less as a man than as an institution, distant, elevated, almost theatrical in his detachment. But Edo was not merely a palace of power. It was also a city of rules. Samurai were required to wear two swords, a visible sign of their status, though in practice they seldom drew them. Merchants, officially low in status, grew wealthy through trade, yet their wealth could not be displayed without restraint, for rules restricted the fabrics and styles they could wear. Townspeople lived within a web of curfews, fire regulations, and codes of conduct. The shogun's order extended into markets, theaters, and even festivals. Daily life in the castle was defined by layers of duty. Samurai retainers served as guards, scribes, and administrators. Palace women managed the inner chambers, where the shogun's consorts lived under watchful supervision. Servants padded softly along wooden corridors, carrying messages or sweeping tatami mats. Bells marked the passing of hours, dividing the day into segments of work, audience, and ritual. Even food carried meaning. Meals in the shogun's presence were conducted with precise etiquette. Bowls of rice, fish, and soup were placed in exact order. The shogun ate sparingly, but the act of being served by retainers carried more weight than the food itself. On New Year's Day, elaborate banquets reinforced loyalty, with lords presenting gifts and affirming their bonds of service. Silence, too, played its role. Unlike the chatter of Versailles, Edo Castle was marked by restraint. Voices were low, movements deliberate, and ceremonies often unfolded with little spoken word. Power was not expressed through noise but through stillness, through the presence of guards at every gate, through the unbroken lines of processions, through the quiet submission of bows. For nearly 3 centuries, these rituals bound Japan in peace. Wars ceased, castles fell silent, and swords rusted in their scabbards. Yet peace itself became a kind of weight. Beneath the calm surface, frustrations grew. Merchants questioned why their wealth did not equal status. Samurai questioned why they bore swords in a world without battle. Daimyo questioned why their power was spent on journeys to Edo rather than governance at home. As you walk through the great corridors of Edo Castle, your footsteps soft against the tatami mats, you can sense the balance, a world of stillness and ceremony, magnificent in its order yet heavy with unspoken tensions. And you may wonder, could such a system, built on rules and appearances, endure forever in a world that was beginning to change? The sun has risen over Edo Castle, casting light across its high white walls and tiled roofs. Within the outer gates, the city hums with life, merchants opening their shops, samurai retainers walking purposefully with their 2 swords, servants sweeping gravel from the paths. But within the castle itself, life is governed by a rhythm of ceremony and hierarchy so precise that it leaves little room for chance. The daimyo, the great lords of the provinces, begin their day by preparing for audiences or fulfilling duties required by the shogunate. Their presence in Edo is not voluntary, it is the heart of the Sankin Kotai system. Each year they travel to Edo in grand processions, leaving behind their provinces for months at a time. Their wives and children remain permanently in Edo as living guarantees of loyalty. In this way, the shogunate transformed potential rivals into participants in a grand performance of obedience. Inside the castle, rules dictated everything. Daimyo entered audience halls barefoot, kneeling upon tatami mats in prescribed positions according to rank. They were required to bow at specific angles, to wait in silence until summoned, and to speak only in formulaic phrases. Even the distance between each man and the shogun was carefully measured. A lord of great domain might kneel a few steps closer than others, but never close enough to forget the gulf between ruler and vassal. These rituals, though exhausting, served a purpose. They kept the daimyo preoccupied, forcing them to spend fortunes on travel, gifts, and maintenance of Edo residences. Some families fell deep into debt, their treasuries emptied not by war, but by the costs of pageantry. Yet to fail in these displays was unthinkable. A daimyo who appeared with too few retainers, or whose robes seemed shabby, risked humiliation and suspicion. In Edo, appearances were loyalty. The retainers of these lords, the samurai, also lived within rules that bound their daily lives. Though they carried swords, few ever drew them in violence. Instead, they served as administrators, clerks, guards, and attendants. Many spent long hours copying documents, monitoring storehouses, or standing watch at castle gates. Their stipends, often fixed for generations, barely kept pace with the costs of living in Edo. Some pawned their armor, Others borrowed from merchants, yet they maintained their dignity through obedience to ritual. The city outside the castle reflected these layers of control. Edo was divided into districts: samurai quarters near the castle, merchant and artisan neighborhoods beyond, and entertainment districts further still. Movement was regulated by curfews, checkpoints, and fire patrols. The people lived under laws that dictated clothing styles, house construction, and even the size of celebrations. The shogunate sought to preserve harmony by limiting extravagance, though in practice, merchants often found subtle ways to bend the rules. Back within the castle walls, the inner court followed a quieter rhythm. The shogun's household, including his wife, concubines, and female attendants, lived in carefully managed seclusion. Palace women rarely left the inner chambers, their lives structured around duties of ritual service, festivals, and the upbringing of heirs. Here too, silence and restraint prevailed, for the shogun's household was as much a symbol of order as his audiences with the daimyo. Communication within the castle was an art of understatement. Messages were delivered by intermediaries, spoken in formulaic phrases or written in elegant brushstrokes. Samurai addressed superiors with rigid courtesy, avoiding any word that might cause offense. Even laughter was subdued. A misplaced word, a breach of etiquette, could draw suspicion or worse. Thus, men and women alike became experts in the language of silence, bows, pauses, gestures carrying more meaning than open speech. But beneath this calm order, there were tensions. Daimyo resented the burden of endless travel and expense. Samurai grew restless with duties that seemed bureaucratic rather than martial. Merchants, though officially of low rank, gained wealth that exceeded that of impoverished warriors. The carefully balanced hierarchy began to strain, though the rituals of Edo masked the cracks. And still, the shogunate endured, decade after decade, sustained less by armies than by these rules of appearance and obedience. The ceremonies of Edo Castle, silent bows, measured steps, controlled processions, were not mere formalities. They were the architecture of Tokugawa power itself. As you watch daimyo kneeling in long rows, their silken robes rustling against tatami mats, their swords placed neatly at their sides, you may wonder, how long could such a system last, when its strength lay not in battle but in the careful maintenance of ritual? The year is now the mid-19th century. For more than 2 centuries, Edo Castle has stood at the center of Japan's political and ceremonial life. Its walls, moats, and gates are unchanged. Its audience chambers are still lined with tatami mats, where daimyo kneel in carefully ordered rows. The rituals of alternate attendance continue, the processions of lords and their retainers still march along the highways to Edo, and the great city itself has grown into one of the most populous in the world. But the balance that once seemed unshakable is beginning to falter. By this time, the once proud samurai are feeling the weight of change most acutely. Many live in poverty, their stipends eroded by inflation, their armor and sword symbols of a past without battles. They continue to stand guard, to write documents, to bow and obey the endless rules of court life. Yet merchants in Edo and Osaka, officially ranked below them in the social order, grow rich through trade, credit, and clever dealings. The samurai, bound to ceremony and honor, borrow money from those they are meant to look down upon. The hierarchy begins to look inverted, though the rules remain outwardly intact. The daimyo, too, suffer under the costs of the senkin-kotai system. Their domains are deeply indebted, their retainers restless. The great processions to Edo, once spectacles of power, are increasingly hollow. Behind the shimmering silks and lacquered armor lie treasuries drained to emptiness. More and more, these rituals feel like burdens carried for the sake of appearances rather than instruments of strength. Then, in 1853, the world shifts. American ships, steam-powered, black-hulled, and bristling with cannon, arrive in Edo Bay under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry. For the first time in centuries, foreign power forces its way past the walls of Tokugawa isolation. The shogunate, so skilled at managing daimyo and samurai, finds itself unprepared to manage gunboats and global demands. Within Edo Castle, the rituals continue. Audiences are held, bows are performed, robes are adjusted with precision. But outside, the certainty that sustained those rituals begins to crumble. Domains divide into factions, some urging resistance to foreigners, others calling for negotiation, still others dreaming of a new order under the emperor in Kyoto. The careful choreography of obedience is slowly replaced by the language of rebellion and reform. Samurai who once spent their days in silent halls now begin to imagine futures beyond the shogunate. Some study Western sciences and weapons. Others join secret societies plotting to overthrow Tokugawa rule. Merchants, too, sense opportunity, lending money to reformist domains and funding the circulation of new ideas. The structure of Edo life, the rigid grid of obedience, shows cracks too deep to ignore. In 1868, the inevitable comes to pass. After centuries of ceremony, the rituals of Edo Castle collapse in a sudden sweep of change. The Meiji Restoration restores power to the emperor, ending the shogunate's authority. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, resigns his post rather than plunge the country into prolonged war. Edo Castle, once the seat of unrivaled ritual power, becomes the residence of the emperor and is renamed the Imperial Palace. The rules of alternate attendance vanish. The great processions cease. The daimyo lose their domains, their families stripped of hereditary privileges. Samurai, long bound by the carrying of swords, are told to abandon them. The hierarchy that sustained Edo life dissolves almost overnight, replaced by a vision of modernization, centralization, and new national identity. Yet the memory of Edo's rules lingers. The quiet corridors, the measured bows, the endless ceremonies, all were not meaningless. For more than 250 years, they held Japan in an era of relative peace unmatched in its history. Though the rituals may appear rigid or stifling to modern eyes, they achieved something that centuries of war could not: stability. And that stability provided the soil from which modern Japan would grow. As you step back from the story of the shogun's court, you might reflect on the weight of rules and rituals. Were they chains, holding men and women in place until the world forced change upon them? Or were they a framework, a carefully woven fabric that gave Japan the strength to endure centuries without war? The fall of Edo was not just the collapse of a castle or a dynasty, it was the end of an entire way of life, in which silence, ceremony, and obedience had been the true weapons of power. And as with all systems built on appearances, the moment belief faded, so too did the world it had created.